The purpose of this entry is the documentation of my current studies progress, and it is recorded purely for the sake of my own journaling. I have left studying math after finishing Techniques of Integration, and I haven't touched the book since I believe April. I do, however, continue to practice spaced repetition on some of the integrals so as to not forget things like trig integrals, integration by parts, and trig substitution. With partial fractions and improper integrals, I only revise the theory behind the technique but don't do any calculations. Likewise, the AFK deck does not seem to ask questions that I don't know the answer to, although because it's been a long time since I've added any cards, there's very few to review every day. Right now, the fluency of solving the exercises I've left in my practice problem deck is the only measure of how I feel about my math abilities. I have some self-doubt and anxiety whenever I struggle with some of those, but looking at the solution, I always realize the mistake. In November, I finished chapter 18, which was the first chapter on thermodynamics. It was also a chapter which made me really impressed and proud of myself, a feeling I had experienced when I reached waves 1, but a few orders of magnitude stronger. It's super awesome that not only was I able to get to thermodynamics all by myself, but also I was able to understand it. It's also quite ironic that the first chapter on thermodynamics is the first chapter that's really burnt me out. I have solved about 70 problems, and perhaps half of those required me to look into the solution manual. I then struggled to understand half of those solutions. I think that what led to my burnout was the fact that I'm always really hard on myself for not being able to solve some of the harder problems immediately and without resorting to look into the manual. This pronounced self-criticism is something that I'm working on with a professional, as it's spilled across most of the things I do in my life. Section 1 and 2 were rather uninteresting, as they mostly defined what temperature really was. The concept of triple point temperature I felt was explained poorly, and I still do not understand it too well, other than it being a property of each substance where it can exist in 3 different phases. I also wrecked my head trying to understand the constant volume gas thermometer, which I later did not need in any of the practice problems. Spending too much time on unimportant details is one of the things that makes self-studying so hard, especially when one struggles with perfectionism. Section 3 was where things got really fun. I enjoyed developing an idea of how objects' dimensions behave when their temperature changes. In Section 4, I learned how to relate that change in temperature to the heat transfer, the mass of the object, and specific heats. It's kinda cool to know about the coefficient of linear expansion and the specific heat properties. Heats of transformation also blew my mind, as it was super cool to find out that objects can release or absorb a lot of heat without actually changing their temperature. Finally, sections 5 and 6 were also very interesting. The first law of thermodynamics along with conduction and radiation were quite eye-opening. Since this is the first video on the engineering progress and development, I will set a baseline for this matter. Throughout the last 3 years, I have been attempting to learn coding without a clear goal nor even a project in my mind. I would try different books and courses, but nothing would really feel adequate, and I felt like I was walking blindfolded with no particular outcome. In 2021, I found out that the language they use in the program that I want to get to is Python, so now the queue is much stronger. I was debating whether I should learn a little bit of code every day while I'm studying physics, or whether I should just dedicate a few months to learn Python alone. I've tried to learn Java while studying mathematics, but it didn't really feel useful at that time. Physics, I feel, wrecks my head to a point where I feel like I can't really learn anything else the day I study it. Now, the course that I'm taking from January to March is actually Programming 1, and if I manage to convince my teacher to let me pass their class just by learning Python from my own resources, I might try actually interleaving physics and coding. Similar to the programming section, this will also be a baseline, as the last time I studied any strictly aerospace resource was several months ago. This particular resource was Introduction to Flight by Anderson, where I've left at section 2.6. Until that point, the book talked about the history of flight as well as defined things like specific volume and a few parameters that gases have. I especially enjoyed learning that it is the differences in pressure and shear stress on the airplane that enable it to fly. Being used to very colorful books like Stewart or Halliday, this book felt a bit lacking on the style aspect, and sadly most of the resources will be like this from this point onward, so maybe it's time I gotten used to the black and white typewriter texts. I currently do not feel like a student, and I'm not as driven as before. This is a natural result of a 4-month-long breakdown where I didn't really study outside of the necessary assignments for my high school classes. It'll take time to get back up to studying a lot and consistently. Currently, the most important issue that I need to address are the constant doubts that I have as I'm going through harder and harder chapters in the physics book. Being very hard on myself does nothing good for me anymore, and now I actually need to be very careful to not overwork myself as to not allow another burnout to happen. The following days will include just an hour or two of studying, if even that. I decided that for now I'm only going to study when I sincerely want to, and I will build up the endurance over time.